Hi, everybody. As folks trickle in, we'll just wait a couple of minutes and then we'll get started. We'll just wait a few more seconds, maybe one more minute, and then we'll get going. All right. It looks like we got a nice critical mass of folks here. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for spending time with us this afternoon. I'm Jim Malowitz. I'm the managing editor for Wisconsin Watch. And for those unfamiliar with us, we're an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit newsroom, and we aim to improve community life in Wisconsin by connecting people with the information they need to navigate their lives, allowing them to push for solutions to challenges, and allowing them to hold those with power to account. And today we're discussing next Tuesday's Supreme Court election. And we really want to encourage folks to participate and by submitting questions during the conversation. You can use the group chat to do that. And you can also use that to engage in other types of conversation on the side. Please keep it civil. And so we hope these events will help us build community around Wisconsin ideas, problems, and solutions. And just so you know, we are powered by donations from people and groups who trust our work and believe in our mission. So please support us any way you can. Our moderator today will be Matt DeFore, and he has been our State Bureau Chief since 2022. Before that, he was a reporter and editor at the Wisconsin State Journal for 16 years. Take it away, Matt.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm joined today by Jack Kelly, who is our star ace reporter in the Statehouse. He's been with us since 2023. And prior to joining Wisconsin Watch, he covered the Statehouse and Wisconsin politics at the Capital Times here in Madison. He grew up in Racine. He spent most of his life here in Wisconsin, including as a student at the UW-Madison. He has been following the Wisconsin Supreme Court closely while he's been at Wisconsin Watch. Because the court currently has a 4-3 liberal majority that it actually got right before he joined us. And with the legislature and the governor divided by party, it's been, really not a lot of big issues have been resolved. But one of the few power centers in Wisconsin that can make major changes affecting the daily lives of Wisconsinites is the Supreme Court. So let's just jump right into it, Jack. This election has already broken the nationwide spending record for state Supreme Court elections, which of course was set by the Wisconsin Supreme Court election in 2023. That one, there was more than $50 million spent. We're now over $90 million. So let's just go back in history here. How did we get here?
Yeah, I mean, let me start with some level setting. That 90 million figure really is remarkable. I mean, that is more money that is spent on many governor's races, U.S. Senate races across the country, especially in states where elections are just not that competitive at the statewide level. How did we get here? There were basically kind of two things that got us to this point. The first is a series of law changes in court rulings that have kind of blown up Wisconsin's campaign finance laws. And critically, back in the 2010s, it became possible for state political parties, so this is the Democratic Party of Wisconsin and the Republican Party of Wisconsin, to raise unlimited amounts of money from individuals. If Matt or I wanted to give $1 million, $2 million, $3 million to one of these state parties, we could. There's no cap on the amount that you can give to the state party. And then there's also this incredible loophole that allows state party committees to transfer unlimited amounts of money to candidate committees. So again, if I wanted to give $2 million to one of the state parties, the state party could then turn around and give it to their preferred candidate. in the same amount. It has kind of blown open this loophole, or it is a loophole that has kind of blown open campaign finance spending in Wisconsin, and it's a way to circumvent the $20,000 maximum contribution that an individual can make to a statewide campaign in Wisconsin. So that's the big one. The legal framework around the way that you can give money changed. The other thing is that partisan actors from across the political spectrum. Right now, we're seeing a ton of spending from conservative groups. We saw a ton of spending from liberal groups back in 2023. They've made this discovery. It's easier to affect the makeup of a 7-member state Supreme Court than it is to change the makeup of a 132-member legislature. So, instead of spending on dozens of state legislative races, they've focused on these spring elections, which are, usually lower turnout, and your bang for your buck just goes a lot farther because you're not competing with a governor's race or a Senate race or a presidential race. And so, they've realized that backing judges and getting them onto the Supreme Court is a way to get the policy wins that they want without having to change the makeup of the legislature, get a bill passed and signed into law by the governor. So it's kind of two pieces, the changing of the campaign finance structure and the growing realization, I guess you could say, by partisan actors that the state Supreme Court is a way to affect policy changes in Wisconsin. So, we've had some of these vicious campaigns before, right? This goes back to 2008, which is widely considered to be the first kind of vicious and partisan campaign, which featured Michael Gableman and former Justice Louis Butler. It's kind of funny, the outside spending on ads then was led by Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, which is the state's largest business lobby, and they spent $1.8 million. And I think I described this recently. That is just a quaint figure today when you consider there are groups spending, $10, $12 million on this race. So it's nothing new, but there have been some key changes over the last kind of 15, 20 years from both a legal framework perspective and a politics perspective that have gotten us to this point.
What I think is the next question I want to ask you is, who are the candidates running? But I think it's really important that we start with the money and these partisan interests, because I think it almost feels sometimes like the candidates running have almost been dwarfed by those two giant just factors in this race. When people go, it feels like our politics is always turning into this sort of like, do you like vanilla or chocolate or flavor A or flavor B? And it seems like it almost doesn't even matter who the candidates are at this point. But that's not the way it's supposed to be in our elections, especially for the Supreme Court. So why don't we talk about who are the two people running for Supreme Court?
Yeah. No, you're totally right. And I'm sure we'll come back to this, but in some ways, this election has become a proxy war in some ways for billionaires on opposite sides of the ideological spectrum who are pushing the political agenda that they want. So who are the candidates? We have two candidates. There was no primary in this election, which was different than 2023. We have Dane County Circuit Court Judge Susan Crawford. She's generally thought of to be the liberal candidate in the race. She's endorsed by the court's 4 current liberal members. And she has had, kind of a long service record, both serving as a public servant and working in private practice. So, for example, she was a prosecutor at the State Department of Justice. When she was a private practice attorney, she, was prominent in a number of things. She worked on behalf of Planned Parenthood, challenging restrictions on abortion in Wisconsin. She worked on behalf of a teacher union, challenging Act 10, the Scott Walker era law that effectively ended collective bargaining rights for public employee unions. She sued to challenge the state's voter ID law. She has a history very much aligned with kind of the liberal legal movement in Wisconsin. And on the conservative side, we have Waukesha County Circuit Court Judge Brad Schimmel. He is a Republican, or I guess a former Republican, because he is nonpartisan in his official capacity now, who served 1 term as Wisconsin Attorney General. And prior to that, he served as the Republican district attorney for Waukesha County. And he's been a judge in Waukesha County since 2018. He was appointed to the bench originally by Scott Walker during the lame duck period after they had both been voted out of office by voters back in 2018. So we have Susan Crawford. She's believed to be the liberal candidate, and we have Brad Schimmel, who is believed to be the conservative candidate. And the spending and the messaging from outside groups certainly reaffirms that belief, I would say.
We've had some really great questions already coming in from the audience. Please submit ones if you have not already. But one question that came in, I think that's, I think people are really curious about is, is this really, is this race in a dead heat? Are we looking at a race that is, we really don't know who's going to win next Tuesday?
Yeah, it certainly feels different than 2023, when all signs seem to be pointing to now Justice Janet Protasewicz winning. I've been having conversations all week with folks about this and for the last several weeks. I think that we are expecting a traditionally Wisconsin tight race next week on Tuesday. I imagine it won't be more than a few points at most, a couple 3 points in either direction. Internal polling based on the campaigns that I've been talking to and folks familiar with the campaigns suggest that it's going to be very close. People are paying attention, right? This is a spring election, but there are national headlines being made about this. People in Wisconsin, are always willing to engage in the electoral process, right? We have one of the most engaged set of voters probably anywhere in the country. So I imagine we're going to see high voter turnout, and I imagine that we're going to see a very close election.
I've been getting postcards from people in California, so I don't know. You mentioned the groups who are supporting each candidate. Let's talk a little bit about that, especially with all this money coming in the race. I think the most obvious group is America PAC and its big donor, Elon Musk. And then obviously I think it's conservatives will point out that, we've seen George Soros and people who are supportive of Democrats getting in on the other side. Who are the groups and individuals who are involved in this race?
Yeah, this is where we come back to this idea of this being an election that's a proxy war for billionaires. So you're absolutely right. The single biggest player in this race by a good margin is Elon Musk, the world's richest person, the close Trump advisor, the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, and his, I guess, the thing that made him famous, he's a tech CEO. He has spent something like $20 million so far on the race. It's about $12 million through his super PAC. It's called America PAC. You've probably been getting text messages or mailers, or you might even have had a door knocker come. The bulk of that money has been spent on voter mobilization. They have really kind of taken over the ground game for the conservative side of this in a way that is similar to what they did for President Trump's campaign back in November. There's another Musk focus group or a Musk affiliated group called Building America's Future. They've spent something like $5 million on TV ads targeting Susan Crawford. And Musk himself has donated several $1,000,000 to the Republican Party of Wisconsin using that exact loophole that I was talking about earlier to then transfer money on to Schimmel's campaign.
You should point out the $20 million that he's put in. We mentioned how the Wisconsin Supreme Court race in 2023 set the new record, more than $50 million in spending. I think so. Elon spent more than the previous record, I think. So just to put it into perspective.
Yeah, right. Just thinking back to the aughts when that race happened, and it was like $15 million, and that was like this big number that had blown people away. You have one person spending, substantially more than even what that was. So, and there's other folks, right? Fair Courts America, they're a group supported by the conservative billionaire Dick Uihlein. They've spent almost $5 million on ads, mostly targeting Crawford. Americans for Prosperity, which is a group with ties to Charles Koch, another billionaire, has spent something like $3 million. And we do see this on the liberal side, right? A group called A Better Wisconsin Together, they've spent $7.7 million. They have some wealthy Democratic donors who contribute to them. One of their biggest financiers is actually kind of the liberal cousin of Dick Uihlein in a only uniquely Wisconsin politics turn of events. And you've also seen a lot of big players in Democratic fundraising and big Democratic funders giving money to the state Democratic Party, who are then taking the money and transferring it to the Susan Crawford campaign. So that includes people like George Soros, who's kind of the infamous liberal financier when it comes to Democratic politics. You have J.B. Pritzker, the billionaire governor of Illinois. Reid Hoffman, who's the co-founder of LinkedIn. So there are billionaires giving money on both sides of this race, and they are, helping bloat this figure above $90 million. And who knows, we might break 100 over the next 6 days here.
We had some attendees who are interested in what kind of money is coming in from outside the state. A lot of that, obviously, that you mentioned from the billionaires. Do we have any kinds of figures in terms of how much each candidate is getting from in-state versus out of state?
Yeah, I don't know the exact figure in my head, but this has been a point of contention. I mean, this came up in the races only debate a couple of weeks ago. Schimmel has really touted that a lot of the money that he has fundraised, like north of 90%, has come from donors in Wisconsin, whereas Crawford has tapped into what is a fairly sophisticated and well-organized national Democratic fundraising apparatus. And so there's definitely money pouring in from out of state. I would make the case that the money being contributed by outside groups is money coming from out of state. Elon Musk is not a Wisconsin resident. Dick Uihlein lives in Illinois. Charles Koch does not live here. J.B. Pritzker is the governor of Illinois. So we're seeing a lot of money come from out of state to try to affect policy here in Wisconsin.
Let's talk about why they're doing this. What is at stake in this election? What happens to control the court? I think you wrote about this earlier, that it's been characterized as, the conservatives might take control. It's not quite that simple, though. So go over that sort of nuance about what a Crawford and Schimmel win means for the composition of the court.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, generally speaking, I say this with the caveat. The ideological control of the court is on the line, right? Right now we have 4 liberal justices. They vote in a block frequently. I believe in their first full term as the liberal majority, they voted together on every single case, the 4 of them. And then we have 3 conservative or conservative-leaning candidates. And so, in theory, whether the liberal or conservative candidate wins next week will shape the court going forward. So what does that look like? If Susan Crawford wins, that will lock in liberal control of the court until at least 2028. Supreme Court justices, are elected to 10-year terms. And we have a provision in the state constitution that says that they can only one justice can be on the ballot at a time. So they're staggered. So just as a little preview here, if you are sick of the TV ads now, brace yourself, because we're going to have a Wisconsin Supreme Court race in 2026, in 2027, 28, 29, and 2030. They're not going away anytime soon. So a Crawford win would mean liberal control until 2028, because the next 2 justices to come up for re-election are both conservative. And a Schimmel win puts us in a less clear area. So it would take the court back to being conservative leaning for sure, but it would really give Justice Brian Hagedorn, who was elected to the court back in 2019, really outsized influence. He's by far the swingiest member of the court. I forget what the exact number was, but in the 3 terms before the liberal majority took over, in 3 decisions, contentious decisions, he was in the majority in like 52 or 53 of the 60 cases that happened. And where Justice Hagedorn goes is really where the direction of the court goes. So he sides with his liberal colleagues basically as often as he sides with his conservative colleagues. And so a Schimmel victory would make things a little bit more uncertain. And so, yeah, ideological control is on the line, but it's a little bit less black and white depending on who wins, I would say.
This is a really good question from BJ Emmerich. He's asking, how can a candidate disassociate themselves from ads put out by a donor they disagree with?
I mean, I guess a strong public statement would be one route. This has come up a lot. If you watched the debate, they talked about this a lot. Susan Crawford worked really hard to tie Brad Schimmel to Elon Musk. At one point she called Elon Musk Elon Schimmel, in what was, obviously a pre-planned line that landed somewhat effectively. But Schimmel says, hey, I'm not Elon Musk. I'm not donating this money. I'm not America PAC. I can't control what they say. And that is true. I mean, outside groups are allowed to spend the money that they want to. If you were a candidate and you really disagreed with it, the most effective means that you would have would to come out with a kind of strong public rebuke. We haven't seen that in this race. Obviously, Schimmel has embraced Elon Musk. He appeared on a live stream with him over the last weekend. He's been touting, and today as a new TV ad out, touting the endorsement of President Trump. So yeah, I mean, there's not a great mechanism to do that. There's no calling the TV station and asking them to take the ad down because you disagree with it.
There have been a lot of questions coming in about where the candidates stand on different issues. And so I think we can go maybe over a few of them. It seems like in this race, there are pretty clear differences on things, but let's kind of see what we know. Do we know where these candidates stand on abortion, for example?
Yeah, I mean, of all of the issues, this is probably the one that is the most black and white. Crawford doesn't like to describe herself as being pro-choice, but has acknowledged that she is. Obviously, she's done work on behalf of Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin trying to protect abortion rights. And you do see this in some of her advertising, right? A lot of ads are focused on the abortion ban and how, Susan Crawford is quote unquote common sense and wants women to be able to make their own healthcare decisions. Some of the kind of typical Democratic lines that we've heard since the Dobbs decision a couple of years ago. Schimmel is personally opposed to abortion, and has this up and down history. He has grappled with how to handle this on the campaign trail. For example, when he was Waukesha County DA, he signed on to this white paper, this plan basically about keeping the 1849 law that Wisconsin has in place so that if Roe was overturned, abortion would be legal in Wisconsin. He has said that he is personally pro-life, but thinks that this should be left up to the voters, trying to borrow a page out of the playbook of Senator Ron Johnson from 2022. At the debate, he talked about how voters should be able to pick, when, if at all, abortion should be restricted in Wisconsin by a referendum. So we definitely have a pro-abortion access and an anti-abortion access candidate in this race. This is maybe the most black and white issue that we have of all of them.
Well, if you watch the ads, it makes it seem as if this race is all about sentencing pedophiles, and that is absolutely not what the Wisconsin Supreme Court is primarily involved in doing. But they do take up a lot of criminal justice referrals. A lot of the issues about people's constitutional rights when it comes to policing will go through the Wisconsin Supreme Court. So, where do these candidates stand on criminal justice issues? What do we know about that?
Yeah, these ones are tougher, right? You're absolutely right. Supreme Court justices are not the people that are sentencing offenders to jail or supervision or any other penalty. That is the work of a trial court judge. Where do they stand on criminal justice? I think that Schimmel would probably draw a harder line than Crawford. He touts a lot of his work and his support from law enforcement, both when he was a prosecutor and now as a judge. It's just, these are one of those things that, these judges, especially at the trial court, the circuit court level, they handle a lot of these cases on a day-to-day basis, but they're not, issuing rulings about things like whether or not somebody's Fourth Amendment rights have been violated. And if they are, they're usually not the last say on it, right? The appeals court or the state Supreme Court gets a chance to weigh in. And so, yeah, you're right. It's really interesting. That has been a big focus of the campaign, even though that is, all things considered, just a very tiny percentage of the work that Supreme Court justices do.
I'd call these ads like the 6 degrees of pedophilia is basically what we've seen, and it's pretty disgusting. But it goes back, like you said, to the Gableman election. It was talking about a criminal defendant who was mischaracterized. So one of the other things that I know is a big issue that we might see a movement on by the court before this next term. So the current court might deal with this issue of the balance between the power of the executive branch and the legislative branch. I want to ask about that first, and then after that, ask about the redistricting issue. But let's start with the balance of power between, we got a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature. How could the courts under these two different candidates address that differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this has been one of the fundamental things to come before the court through a series of, well, it's one lawsuit, but a series of pieces of the same lawsuit over the last kind of year and a half. It's no secret, if you live in Wisconsin, the Republican-controlled legislature and Democratic Governor Tony Evers have been at odds on many, if not most, issues. And the court has been asked to weigh in. So, for example, the court issued a ruling in a case last summer, basically that took away certain oversight authority of the legislature when it comes to certain conservation projects in the state. People say, big whoop, like, why does that matter? Well, now there's a lot of chatter about whether or not that program is going to be renewed with more funding in the next state budget. There's also questions about whether or not the legislature, a legislative committee can strike down rules that are created by a professional board. And that's significant because professional boards are in some way controlled by the governor. He appoints the people who sits on them. We saw this come up a couple of years ago. The professional board that oversees family therapists in Wisconsin made it a professional rule, that if you violate, you lose your license, basically banning conversion therapy in the state. and a committee struck it down, and they went to court, and we're waiting to decide to hear whether or not that was permitted or not. So this is significant in the sense that they are now the people who are weighing in on the power disputes between the more traditionally political branches of government. The court so far has been very friendly to the governor, not entirely, but friendly. One legal expert described it to me as the court has been reining in the quote unquote legislative supremacy that we've had in Wisconsin over the last kind of 15 years. So Crawford victory would probably leave us on that path of elevating the Democratic governor over the Republican legislature, whereas a Schimmel victory probably takes us in another direction. So the court seems to touch every aspect of Wisconsin politics and many aspects of everyday life in Wisconsin, I feel like, in ways that people don't realize.
I would think it's an easy case to make that the most consequential decision so far from this liberal majority court was the redistricting decision.
Yeah.
That decision in, I believe, 2023 laid the groundwork for the governor and the legislature actually to agree on new, less gerrymandered maps than what we previously had in place. And the evidence for that is that in the 2024 election, the Democrats actually flipped 14 seats in a very good year for Republicans. So for anyone watching, if you didn't think the maps were gerrymandered before that, you're just wrong. But Jack, talk to us about how that decision, well, there's a question about whether the congressional maps, which were proposed by Governor Evers and approved by the courts back in 2021, 2022, those are still in place. Is it possible that Susan Crawford, if she were to win, could be involved in the decision to overturn those? And if you don't want to see that happen, maybe Brad Schimmel would not be inclined to toss out those maps.
I mean, absolutely. This has been one of the biggest points of contention between the two candidates in the race. Susan Crawford appeared, she says briefly, I've talked to her about this, on a Zoom call that was organized by a group that is advocating. They described this election as a way to put 2 more U.S. House seats in play, basically implying that a Susan Crawford victory could result in new congressional districts that maybe imperil people like Derek Van Orden in Wisconsin's 3rd district and Brian Stile in Wisconsin's 1st congressional district, who are, those are toss-uppy districts. Maybe in a great year for Democrats, a Democrat could win, but are definitely Republican leaning. That her winning could be a way to change those districts and to help Democrats win back the House in 2026. Schimmel has hit Crawford for this over and over again. She said, "Hey, I got invited. I spoke for a few minutes and I left before any talk about that has come up." But it has continued to be a factor in this race. I mean, just over the weekend, when Schimmel appeared on a live stream with Elon Musk on Twitter, or I guess X now, Musk said, "I'm interested in this race because it is the only way that we can protect the Republican majority and make sure that President Trump's agenda is not stalled." Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader of the U.S. House, was talking yesterday about how this election is one of the first steps to Democrats winning back the House in 2026. And his campaign actually just transferred money to Susan Crawford. So yes, absolutely, the future of what the congressional districts in Wisconsin look like are at stake. I would say, and that has huge national implications beyond just what happens here in Wisconsin, given that the Republican majority in the House right now is so narrow. And if history has told us anything, the first general election, major year, even number election after Donald Trump takes the White House is a good year for Democrats. So there's a lot at stake. It reverberates everywhere.
I do want to talk a little bit about the campaigns, these candidates' campaign strategies. We did have an audience member ask, why did it take the Crawford campaign so long to settle on a message tying Schimmel to Musk? You mentioned that we heard that at the debate, but really that wasn't their strategy. Maybe just talk a little bit about how this campaign has evolved from the early strategies from both candidates to what we're seeing today.
Yeah, it has been a pretty remarkable evolution, I will say. I wrote a piece about this a couple of weeks ago and talked to a lot of folks who follow elections here in Wisconsin very closely. in some ways, if we're looking back to 2023, Brad Schimmel is the person that has been using the playbook established by Janet Protasiewicz, being pretty forthcoming about talking about your values, really kind of doing the statewide barnstorming and appearing at kind of partisan political events. And Susan Crawford has taken more of the approach of Dan Kelly, who always wanted to shy away from issues, wanted to talk about how he was focused on the law and being impartial, et cetera. I mean, that has definitely changed and has changed quite a bit over the last few weeks, I would say. Why did it take them so long to tie Schimmel to Elon Musk? I would say timing. This is an awkward time for a really consequential election, right? Donald Trump has been back in the White House for just over 2 months. Elon Musk has been bulldozing through Washington with Doge for just over 2 months. It takes time for people and the public at large to generate opinions about people, right? Like, it wasn't he started on January 20th and all people were up in arms about it on January 21st. There were certainly some people that were that way, but it takes a while to kind of permeate out among the public. And so I think we're starting to see her do it now because it's starting to show in their polling and in their focus groups that people, when they tie Schimmel to Musk, it hurts Musk, or it hurts Schimmel, because people see it as being corrupt. We've seen this change in the ads. It used to be that Brad Schimmel was too extreme for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Now it's that Brad Schimmel is too corrupt for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. So things really evolve. Also, Musk was like dangling his feet in the water, testing the temperature on whether he was really going to invest for a couple of weeks. It was like, oh, he put $1 million in. Oh, he's up to $2 million. And over the last couple of weeks, I mean, it's exploded. Now he's at $20 million. That's completely different. And so, I think the timing was it. They needed the time needed to pass so that they could see whether or not it was going to be effective. Which, when you're running in an April 1st election, and that doesn't start until January 20th, leaves kind of this truncated timeline that we've seen them operate on.
I do really wonder if this race will be truly the first national referendum on Trump 2.0, on Elon Musk. It seems like it has the makings of that. It seems like on the day after the election, we'll be talking about whether Musk's funding catapulted Schimmel into winning this election, or if tying Elon Musk to Schimmel was a winning strategy for Crawford. But again, we don't really know what the answer is going to be until then. But I do want to talk about there's been some controversial issues in this race. I think we do need to mention, this race, there'll be a lot to write about after this race is over. For example, we saw Elon Musk's America PAC offering voters $100. Can you explain that controversy and what it means? What's the legality of what was going on there?
Yeah, so this is a piece of the America PAC playbook. We saw something similar back in November when he was really whipping votes for President Trump, especially in Pennsylvania, but in other battleground states, including Wisconsin. America PAC is offering voters $100 if they sign a petition, and the petition is supposed to be in opposition to activist judges. Basically, America PAC is doing this somewhat clever thing, this novel thing of paying people to sign up for this petition. And what they're really doing is, gathering information about voters who might be interested in this race so that they can then, target them with door knocking and mailers and everything else. It's actually funny, if you go read the terms and conditions of this, like I did, they make it very clear. They're like, don't expect to be paid within a month or even 2 months. It'll come eventually, which is funny. Is it legal? I have been reporting all day today trying to figure that out. There is a state statute that basically says you can't offer anything of value, and there's this big broad definition of anything of value, which includes money, to induce somebody to vote for or against a candidate. It doesn't explicitly say, like, sign this petition pledging that you're going to vote against Susan Crawford or you're going to vote for Brad Schimmel. But, the follow-up messaging that people who have signed this petition are getting from America PAC probably strongly is pushing them towards voting for Brad Schimmel. So is it illegal? I'm not sure. I will say if you violate this statute, It is a Class I felony in Wisconsin, which can have an up to $10,000 fine and imprisonment of up to 3.5 years. And so it'll be interesting. I look forward to getting the answer on this, and I'm wondering if we'll see somebody try to bring a lawsuit. Now, it can be confusing because in theory, if they were breaking the law, it should be brought by a prosecutor, elected district attorney. Will there be some sort of civil action against them? It's kind of messy. There was a whole legal mess about this in November in Pennsylvania. So I don't know. Remains to be seen. I'm not sure is the answer to that question, but it is certainly kind of a novel approach to getting people to turn out.
You mentioned that this was brought, or the issue was raised in this offer to oppose activist judges. I'm kind of curious to unpack that, because this is a line we've heard again. I think going all the way back to the Gableman election. I think Louis Butler, the justice at the time, the first incumbent to lose in I think more than 40 years. I think that was the characterization, was that he was an activist judge. What does that mean, and what are we seeing from the justices who have served on the court since 2008 in terms of, are they activist or not?
Yeah, so being an activist judge, the idea of judicial activism is that you're a judge who uses your authority on the bench to stretch as far as you can the meaning of a law or the frameworks that you're being asked to weigh in on, to advance, your own or an ally's political agenda. Is the present liberal majority been kind of engaged in judicial activism? That is very much dependent upon who you ask. They've been accused by their conservative colleagues on the court of being outcome focused. You might have folks on the left that says you didn't go far enough. A perfect example of this is their biggest and most consequential decision so far, which is the gerrymandering case, right? In that lawsuit, they were asked, does partisan gerrymandering violate the Wisconsin Constitution? And they said, I don't know, we're not going to pick it up. They didn't even weigh in on that issue. They instead threw out the maps on a technicality, kind of doing it very narrow and reining themselves in a way that if they wanted to, they could have taken the case and said, yeah, it does violate the state constitution. So I think, who is an activist judge? The answer will depend on who you ask. What I will say is that, we've seen the court take some cases to undo rulings that were handed down by their conservative colleagues, a year, 2 years earlier. Judges are usually really hesitant to overturn precedent. They're usually hesitant to do it along ideological lines because judges like to build consensus. So we've certainly seen elements of that. I've asked legal experts about this. Sometimes they say they're just rebalancing Wisconsin politics. But again, are they judicial activists? It depends who you ask, and the answer will change pretty much from everyone.
I do want to bring up what I would consider maybe one of the more consequential decisions of the sort of the Brian Hagedorn era of the court. And that was the case in which the Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld the results of the 2020 election, 4-3 decision in which Hagedorn joined the liberal minority in that case. Is this a kind of case that we are looking at as, if Schimmel is elected, what would we expect going forward? Are people? I think there are some people concerned or raising this alarm bell that the court could intervene in election cases. But I think that's where it's really important for people to understand that this election does not change that 2020 sort of split majority.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't. Justice Hagedorn wrote the opinion in that case, and it was interesting. It was kind of it was a very judicial cop-out in some ways. They basically said, you took too long. You should have raised concerns about the issue, about the way that people were voting before they were voting, before they had voted, not after the fact. Brad Schimmel has said that it doesn't matter who the plaintiff in the courtroom before him is. If Donald Trump sues and is wrong on the law, he'll rule against him. He has said that. That being said, he also has cut an ad today that says, Donald Trump endorsed me, you should vote for me. So, what exactly does it mean? It's not totally clear, but yeah, you're totally right. The liberal, what would be a liberal minority come August, if Schimmel wins, will be different, but it's just a matter of changing one justice who Hagedorn seems to be quite friendly with when they interact with each other in public, and the opportunities that I've had to see that. So I don't know how much it would change. I certainly don't think that it would be a sure thing that the court would have just reversed and all of a sudden, you know, some 220,000 votes would have been disqualified in 2020.
Is there any reason to think that Schimmel would be similar to, like, who would he be most like on the court? I guess I should ask the same about Crawford. But let's start with Schimmel. I think there are a lot of Republicans and conservatives who are disappointed by Brian Hagedorn not adhering to their viewpoint on a lot of issues. Would Schimmel be in the mold of a Brian Hagedorn, or would he be more maybe in the mold of an Annette Ziegler or a Pat Rogensack, who's no longer on the court, or a Rebecca Bradley, who's perhaps the most conservative member of the current body?
It's hard to say for certain, for sure. I think that he would be more in the kind of Annette Ziegler, Rebecca Bradley space than he would be in the Brian Hagedorn space. Obviously, Schimmel is kind of in some ways, I guess, an unusual candidate for the Wisconsin Supreme Court, right? Like, this is a guy that served in statewide office already as a Republican in partisan office. He has run for office many times as a Republican, which you don't necessarily see all that often in judicial elections. Of course, there are some high profile instances of this. You know, David Prosser became a Supreme Court justice here in Wisconsin after he was the Speaker of the State Assembly. But, you know, it was a different era, I would certainly say. So I don't know. I imagine he would be a more reliable conservative vote, but I guess it depends, and I guess it depends on how true he's willing to stick to some of the things that he said on the campaign trail. Crawford is interesting. You know, she said at the debate, I would like to think of myself as, you know, trying to not fill the shoes of retiring Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, but modeling myself after her. Ann Walsh Bradley has served on the court for 30 years. You know, she's kind of anchored the liberal majority for the last, year and a half that it's existed. And so, you know, I think that it's a really interesting question. And I think we'll find out quickly once they take the bench in August, or I guess, you know, into the fall next year when we start to see new decisions from them, based on the way that they write and how they attach things to certain orders and whether or not they lash out at each other publicly, which we've seen a lot of. So I think it's a little bit hard to tell. I would say that I would probably guess that both of them would be reliably more liberal and reliably more conservative than somebody like Brian Hagedorn.
Is there anything to say for, we talked about the congressional district lines. Is there anything else coming down from the Trump administration where the candidate who wins this election could shift the way that the Wisconsin Supreme Court handles matters of national importance under, you know, with what the Trump administration is doing?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So, you know, a lot of the work that Trump is doing is at the federal level, right? And it is controlled and is being checked, at least in part, by federal courts. But that's not to say that the Wisconsin Supreme Court can't have influence on some of these issues, right? I think that state Supreme Courts and state courts generally have their influence and their importance has grown significantly in the post-Dobbs era, the post, you know, decision from 2022 that overturned Roe versus Wade. And I say that because let's, for example, you know, look at like trans rights and issues concerning trans folks in Wisconsin. Trump administration has been signing a number of executive orders as it pertains to trans folks in the United States. You could bring a lawsuit in Wisconsin in state court arguing that the Wisconsin Constitution protects people or offers certain protections. And if you got a ruling, that would be the law of the land in Wisconsin, right? Because the Wisconsin Supreme Court is the final arbitrator. They have the final say on what it means to be state law in Wisconsin. And so I think there are ways that, you know, certainly if you are a liberal leaning attorney and a part of kind of the liberal legal movement, you are looking to the state Supreme Court for ways to secure certain victories when you might not be able to do so at the federal level. So, you know, I don't think it'll be directly Trump orders X and the Wisconsin Supreme Court rules Y, but I certainly think that there could be some kind of downstream effects from that.
I do want to get to more audience questions, and please keep them coming. We've had a couple good ones so far. We've had some great ones from people when they registered. Jen K asked a question I'm not sure we have the answer to, but I'll read it anyway because I appreciate that she submitted it. She said, I'm curious if you can speak to what companies or entities benefit the most from all this spending? Many local TV stations are owned by giant media conglomerates, and social media is the same. Are there any conflicts of interest there, since so many of these companies are getting more and more involved in politics? Seems like a great journalism question, because I can just, all I would say is usually a lot of these television stations try to separate editorial and business side, but I'm not sure how much that's true anymore. But Jack, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that it's, if you were going to own a local TV station, owning it in Wisconsin is probably better than owning it in like Wyoming, because you have important, consequential, tens of millions of dollars in spending elections seemingly every year. I think that is an accurate assessment. There are obviously some locally owned TV stations still in the state, I believe, but yeah, I mean, that the money goes to the station, which would go to their owner. Same thing with a lot of these digital ad buys, right? Like where do you interact, or where do we as a society interact with one another online the most, right? Platforms owned by Meta. We watch content on YouTube. Something like 25% of all things streamed on the internet happen on YouTube, and those are controlled by major tech companies. So yeah, I mean, that is where the money is going for sure, and it's really interesting. I would love to own a TV station and take $25 million in ad buys.
I will say that over the weekend I broke down and I just got like a month subscription to HBO Max so I could watch the NCAA tournament.
Yeah.
And I did not see any local ads on that streamer. So I
You
think I knew when they
found
were
a safe space.
would be that, like, the programming will turn soon for like 15 seconds at the end of like the national ad blocks. And so I was like, oh, I'm sure I'm missing a Brad Schindler, Susan Crawford ad right now.
Yeah,
So
as a person who watched on local TV, I can assure you, you were missing out on a Brad Schindler or Susan Crawford campaign ad.
And I do want to read this question from our own Tom Kircher. Full disclosure, he is a Wisconsin Watch, he's our fact checker, but he asked a good question. Does the influx of money mean that Wisconsin Supreme Court candidates will themselves become more partisan? Are we seeing more partisanship from the court as a result of all this money flooding in over the last 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Tom. When I spoke to experts about this, right? And some people have said that to be a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice, you have to run an effective statewide campaign. That takes a particular skill set. That takes access to particular resources. And a lot of that comes with being more partisan, right? Even though this race is nonpartisan officially, it's nonpartisan on paper when you go to vote on Tuesday next week, or if you're voting absentee early, there will not be a D or an R next to Susan Crawford and Brad Schimmel's names. They will just be listed because it is a nonpartisan race. But the thing is that if you want to win in these elections, you have to be more partisan. This is what experts tell me over and over again. You have to find people who are willing to give partisan cues to voters so that they can make a decision and back you. And so, yeah, I mean, if you are a person who is interested, like say Elon Musk, in spending 10 or $20 million on a race like this, you probably want to go out and find a candidate, or hope that a candidate is recruited that is willing to give the partisan cues that you want to spend on behalf of. So it's kind of this like back and forth where it's also interesting because voters play a role in this, right? Because it's a nonpartisan race, voters are looking for partisan cues to help them decide who they should vote for. So it's kind of this big feedback loop of voters want partisan cues. Candidates have to give partisan cues because they need to get voters, but also because they need to get funding. Funders need partisan cues from the candidates so that they know who to put the money behind. So it's kind of this big feedback loop that gives us these more partisan elections. I mean, I think it's probably pretty safe to say that the somewhat sleepy springtime elections of yesteryear, where if you were an attorney and a well-respected attorney, you were being encouraged to run to be a judge because people in the legal community thought that you would be making a significant contribution. Now people are being recruited so that they can help deliver partisan outcomes. So it has certainly changed the dynamic. If you ask somebody in the 1990s if we were going to get to $90 million in spending in an April election on a state Supreme Court race, they would have laughed you out of the room that you were sitting in. So it has definitely changed the dynamic.
This is a question from an audience member. I don't know if we have a great answer to this, but they asked, what do people in rural conservative areas of the state think about the trend toward negative attack ads? Do we have anything that kind of give us a sense as to how the public is being turned on or turned off by the tenor of this race?
It's hard to tell. We saw huge turnout increases in rural parts of the state in November. largely for President Trump. So it'll be interesting to see if they're willing, if folks that live in more rural parts of Wisconsin are willing to engage in this race in the way that they were in 2024. What I will say is this, we have seen, and we have talked a lot about this, Matt, just an incredible decline of local journalism across the state, especially in smaller and more rural communities, which is to say that these ads, which are, fueled by billionaires that paint the worst possible picture of both candidates, are increasingly the only way that people engage with the candidates and get information about them. And that's probably felt especially, it's probably felt acutely in places like rural Wisconsin, where maybe you don't have access to a daily local news organization anymore that might be sitting with the candidates when they stop to stump in your town. So I think it has changed politics in many ways, but the ads continue to fill kind of the hole in the information space in a way that in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, there would have been other information accessible to voters.
So we referred to all this that's happening, everything we've discussed in our recent article. I think we called it the nasty new normal of Supreme Court politics, or just politics in general. I'd be curious to hear from the audience if you would like to submit in the questions here, or in the chat, just your thoughts on what's our way out of this. Is this something you're comfortable with? Or do you think that something needs to change in the way our system is structured, either through laws or through the Constitution? I mean, one of the big challenges we face in dealing with any of this is that the U.S. Supreme Court, going back to what you said at the beginning, Jack, they have said that money is speech, essentially, that corporations are people, and that we can basically spend as much money on these elections as we want, because that's free speech, baby. So, I'd be curious if people have any thoughts on, what is the solution? I saw the Wisconsin State Journal, my old paper, in their endorsement over the weekend. They had mentioned something that they've mentioned countless times, I think, in their editorials, the idea of merit selection. I don't know, Jack, if you wanted to weigh in on anything you've done looking into the idea of alternative ways we could elect or select or pick our judges and our justices in the state. Is there anything to be said for different ways of doing it, or is this the best we can do?
Yeah. There are many people who are much smarter than I am, who have spent many hours researching and writing about this. I've talked to many of them. I've written a story about this more than a year ago, or about a year ago. What I learned when I talk to legal experts, people who think about our judicial system and how things should be shaped, is that there is no good way to pick a judge. Some states use merit selection, which is basically a panel, usually the state bar is involved, kind of filters a list of candidates and presents some finalists to either a commission or the governor, and then that group makes an appointment to a judgeship. Oftentimes those folks then face retention elections, which is just literally they appear on the ballot and it's like, should this person get to keep their job, yes or no? Other states do elections. Here in Wisconsin, I think it's fewer states, but we elect our judges here in Wisconsin. And there are pros and cons that come along with that. Obviously, there is maybe an easier way to hold folks accountable. But then you get $90 million state Supreme Court races that have a lot of partisan players in them. So it can maybe kind of sour the nonpartisan and what it means to be a judge. But I can only say this to highlight and underscore how nobody can agree. So here in Wisconsin, we talk a lot about, well, should we appoint judges? Should the governor get to do it? Should we have a bipartisan commission? Whatever, right? Just go a couple states over to Kansas, where right now voters are actively trying to change the Kansas Constitution to go from appointing their Supreme Court justices to electing them, because in Kansas, the state Supreme Court is very liberal leaning for being a pretty red state, because they've mostly been appointed by Democratic governors. And people want to change it to elections so that, especially Republican lawmakers there who have supermajorities in the Kansas legislature, so that they can then advance the Republican agenda that the liberal Supreme Court has kind of checked. So there's no good way to do it if you ask legal experts. And we all have settled on the systems that we've settled on. And, they are what they are.
Is there any way? I mean, at this point, I don't know if there is, but I mean, what are your thoughts on the money issue? I know, our listeners, our viewers are keenly interested in the money issue.
the money issue is a really interesting one. For the myriad reasons that we've outlined over the last 45 minutes or so. I think that there are some options that could try to combat this. For example, you could make elections publicly funded, right? If you're one of the candidates that gets to the general election, you get, I don't know, say $1 million each. Do with it what you want, but you can only use $1 million. And you could pass some sort of law to kind of try to rein in outside spending. But you come back to the issue, right? Citizens United, money is speech. Corporations and outside groups should be able to spend unlimited amounts because otherwise their First Amendment rights are violated. So it can be pretty challenging. I mean, other folks have talked about trying to change the system as a whole, have a publicly funded campaign, have the finalists be selected by some sort of committee, and then elect the judge or justices to a single long term so that they can be on the bench. They can have gotten there without having to take in money from anybody, and then they can rule however they want because there's no prospect of having, being rehired or having your contract extended, so to speak. So there's a lot of chatter about it. Some people point to New Mexico as a good way to do it. They kind of have a bipartisan commission that does merit selection, but then some people really like elections. So how do we get the money out of elections? You would need some significant changes in court rulings and state and federal finance law, which, surprising probably no one, don't seem like they will be coming anytime soon.
I'm gonna ask as a last question, audience member question, because they asked like a great final question. So I'm just gonna steal it from them. They said, what should we be watching for in the final stretch? Messaging, turnout, spending. The election is less than a week from today. And what does that final stretch tell us about 2026? Any clues?
Yeah, I will be paying very close attention to the early voting numbers. I mean, we've seen kind of an explosion in early voting, both here in Dane County, where we are, in Milwaukee County, and in the WOW counties, the kind of traditionally Republican stronghold, the Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington counties. I think those numbers could be telling. And they certainly gauge enthusiasm. I mean, we've seen this big spike in it. Will we see a big spike in election day voting and break maybe another turnout record for a spring election? I think that'll be telling. Spending, or their last minute splurges, right? The closer you get to when a TV ad is going to air, the more expensive it is. Do we see a kind of a flood in the last minute because somebody is trying to shore up their position, or because they're trying to regain ground? That's something I'll be keeping track of. And then I'm interested to see, it's hard to tell if this is going to be a precursor for 2026. I would make the argument that this election has been more about Elon Musk than it's been about Donald Trump. They become increasingly difficult to separate from one another every day, especially probably in the mind of the public. But I think it'll be really interested to see how some of the traditionally battleground places in the state vote. How will Sauk County vote? How will Door County vote? How will some of the, kind of rural and small city counties in western Wisconsin, like Eau Claire County and La Crosse County, vote? As well as how will Racine County and Kenosha County, my hometown, who are traditionally have been two of the most 50-50 counties in the state, how will they vote? Because every election, every opportunity for voters to go to the polls and weigh in on what's going to happen is another data point that we can all obsess over for which direction things are going in the world of politics in the state. But yeah, I'm really focused on those early voting numbers, the spending, and then of course I think the election night numbers, particularly in those traditional strongholds, but in also other parts of the state. Janet Protasewicz did really well in other parts of Wisconsin compared to a lot of liberal or Democratic candidates in the past. Can Susan Crawford, come anywhere close to that? If she can, it could be a good night for her on Tuesday. We'll wait, and we'll have to wait and see.
Great. Well, thanks, Jack. I want to give Tom Kircher, thanks for his suggestion. Spoiler alert, he might be the next person doing one of these sessions. This has been our second one. I'm going to turn it back over to Jim Malowitz. Thanks so much, Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, and thanks, Matt and Jack. It's really great to have your level of in-depth knowledge here in the Zoom room. And this is obviously a really high stakes event. So just a couple of final housekeeping events, and thanks everybody for joining us. It was so great to see all the people join and stay throughout the really interesting chat. When you exit this chat, a donation page should pop up. And this is just another reminder that we are powered by donations. Investigative journalism and politics journalism is expensive. Just think about the price of eggs, multiply that by whatever. And so we'd encourage you to support us if you have the means. We'll also be sending around a survey for attendees after this, and we'd really love to hear your feedback and suggestions for future chats like this, because again, we're also powered by that feedback and insight and perspectives because we want to serve the public. Otherwise, yeah, look for that, look for a recording, and maybe send it to your friends if you think it was an interesting conversation.
And subscribe to Forward if you don't already. Jack Kelly writes our newsletter every Monday. And if you aren't a subscriber, there's some great insights into state government every Monday in your inbox.
Thanks, everyone.